Hello, I'm Ed Butler. Welcome to Business Daily from the BBC. Coming up, does the anti-European sentiment of some Britons ahead of next week's Brexit vote suggest a wider challenge to established leadership?
You have significant numbers of Americans and Brits that do not in any way trust the establishment. They don't believe that they are going to be economically better off, and they want something different.
Also in the programme today, protesters in the Serbian capital fight back against a large-scale urban development plan.
We say don't drown Belgrade because they are trying to take away our city and drown it with the malicious project Belgrade Waterfront.
All that to come in Business Daily from the BBC. Campaigning in the historic UK referendum on EU membership has been temporarily suspended today. This follows the murder of a UK MP, Jo Cox, a representative of the opposition Labour Party. She was stabbed and shot in the street of her constituency on Thursday. No precise motive has yet been established, although there are reports that far-right nationalist slogans were shouted as the suspected gunman was apprehended. Speaking on Thursday, the Prime Minister David Cameron paid tribute to Jo Cox, a mother of two and a leading campaigner for the rights of Syrian refugees.
We've lost a great star. She was a MP, great campaigning MP with huge compassion, with a big heart, and people are going to be very, very sad at what has happened. Dreadful, dreadful news. It's right that we're suspending campaigning activity in this referendum, and everyone's thoughts will be with Jo's family and with her constituents at this terrible time.
Well, of course, it's not yet clear how the murder might affect next week's referendum votes. Responding to the killing, the IMF has delayed publication of another economic report on the potential impact of Brexit. It's already said there would be a huge economic risk, both for Britain and the EU, if that happened. I've been speaking to Ian Bremmer about the referendum. He's a political scientist and the president of the Eurasia Group, and he's an opponent as well of those wishing to separate Britain from the EU. With some recent opinion polls giving the Leave campaign a slight lead, I asked him if there was a mounting sense of panic in the US.
Panic. I wouldn't say there's panic, not in the United States. There's panic here. There's no question. I've been experiencing that in the last 24 hours across London. But no, in the United States, I would say following it, a little bit wistful, a little bit bemusement. Most people probably aren't aware it's going on.
You have suggested that there's a parallel between the UK Leave campaign and the campaign for Donald Trump in the US. Really?
There's very clearly a parallel, sure. I mean, you have significant numbers of Americans and Brits that do not in any way trust the establishment, that they don't believe that they're going to be economically better off, irrespective of the promises that are made, and they want something different. And frankly, they see voting for something different as not being a risk. They see sticking with the same as being a risk, right? Because usually you think of a referendum and you say, well, people are going to stay with it because that means that, you know, if they're uncertain, then you want to stick with where you are. But if you believe that your trajectory is only to ruin by continuing with politicians that have been doing nothing but lying to you and not providing for their citizenry, then you start thinking very differently about how you want to vote. That's very clearly what's been behind the Trump and the Sanders campaign. Trump's also had the identity politics piece, of course, which has been very toxic. While in Britain, it's what is absolutely behind the Brexit campaign. And, you know, there aren't many people there's certainly no economists that believe that there's any truth in some of the more fantastical things that the Brexit folks have been saying about what it would mean for the British economy. But that doesn't stop it from being attractive as a narrative to significant pieces, even almost half, it looks like, of the British electorate.
Similarly, it is argued that elite government and economic types understate and undervalue the impact that immigration is having on low-income people in receiving countries, with Mexicans in the US, East Europeans in the UK.
Well, I mean, I think that immigration in the United States has become an issue that is more about identity politics than economics. In other words, I think Trump does very well when he talks with older white people who believe that the country no longer represents them. The younger people are more pro-immigration. They are much more oriented towards secularism as opposed to being religious, social liberalism as well, on gay marriage, death penalty, you name it. That's very different from saying these people are taking our jobs, the great sucking sound that you'd heard Ross Perot talk about with NAFTA. You don't have really that. And now you have the Islam piece and security as well. In Britain, there's much more of an economic argument that's being made around immigration as opposed to just the Muslim piece, just that these people are different. And I think that does actually make it more compelling for many, and it makes it, frankly, much more likely that you end up with a Brexit than that you end up with a Trump president in the United States.
There is also an argument, of course, in the UK that the European Union is perhaps in terminal decline. Better to jump a sinking ship than to go down with it.
Well, look, there's no question that this is not the easiest time to give good reasons for why you want to stick with the Europeans. There is an absence of leadership. There is a refugee crisis. There is populism across the continent, and growth is anemic. Having said all of that, it's hard for me with any amount of economic training to say that the smart thing for the Brits to do is thumb their nose at their most important trading partner and say, well, we'll just trade with other people. That's not compelling. The compelling piece is for many people who believe that even if the British economy does well, they won't benefit. In the United States, there are many people that say, well, great, we do NAFTA, we do the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the top 1% does well, but what about us? I don't have a good argument for those people because, frankly, they've been lied to. And the social contract in the United States has eroded to the extent that it effectively excludes decent parts of the American population. So you can't, with good faith, tell these people you should support free trade, that Hillary's going to be great for you. And I do think that's a reasonable and compelling argument.
You've written that a victory for Brexit and for Donald Trump could mark a permanent fissure between Europe and the United States. Isn't that a bit of an exaggeration?
Well, I would argue that the transatlantic relationship is the most important alliance in the world over the last 75 years. And I don't think you can argue with the idea that today in 2016, it is at its weakest point in that period. And some of that is American unilateralism, and some of that is British unilateralism. It's really every nation for itself. So there is kind of a race to the bottom. And absolutely, I believe that were the U.S. to elect Trump and were the Brits to leave the EU, we could no longer look at the transatlantic relationship as having that importance, either in a year or going forward. I think the world will have changed very dramatically. Now, the world may be changing dramatically anyway. We have a pivot to Asia. China is going to be the world's largest economy. The question really is, you said it yourself, if the EU is a sinking ship, why not get off now? Well, the question is, how much do you actually want to have a role in determining what the next ship is going to look like? And what's been very clear from the Brits is not many people care about that. They think that, well, that's just going to happen. And so we're only focused on whether this in or out is transactionally useful to us. That's what's so problematic, is that we're not talking about relationships that have duration anymore, right? I mean, if you're married to someone for 50 years, you don't try to split the check and say, well, you got something more expensive, so you're going to pay for that. But that's precisely what Donald Trump says about relationships with allies, with Mexico, with Japan, with South Korea, with the Gulf states, with the Europeans. And if you're the Brits, the fact that the Europeans actually need your leadership, years ago, that would have meant something to you. It doesn't anymore. And I think you need to reflect on that. What does it mean about Britain, never mind Great Britain, that you don't care anymore about the impact of your leadership on people outside your country? I think you lose a lot. And I think that means whether you vote to stay in or leave, Europe is going to be much less than it was.
Political risk commentator Ian Bremmer of the Eurasia Group. Well, for a slightly different view, I have also been speaking to Gerard Lyons. He's a former economic advisor to the Conservative MP Boris Johnson, and he's a member of Economists for Brexit.
The big issue for me is how we position both the United Kingdom and indeed the European Union in a changing, growing global economy. And without any doubt, there's a shift in the balance of power. We're seeing the emergence of the Indo-Pacific region, India, China, the US. And to really prosper in that changing global economy, the UK, in many respects, needs to distance itself from the slow growth region of the world economy, namely the European Union, still keep on good terms with it, but really start to position itself to benefit and actually have greater levers of power in our control.
I don't really understand this argument. How is it that leaving a big trading bloc, no matter what its economic performance at any given moment, leaving that trading bloc and becoming a very much smaller, more isolated trading unit, as Britain would be when it left it, how would that actually help Britain?
Well, Britain's not isolating itself at all. In actual fact, this is a debate between being a global Britain versus being an inward-looking insular European Union.
We are actually only voting, though, to leave the European Union, not to do anything else. I mean, that is what the vote is.
The European Union seems focused very much on becoming even more a political union, and it needs to do that because at the core of the EU is the unstable euro. And even though we're not in the euro here in the UK, we can't help but be influenced by it if we were to stay within the European Union. And what we need to actually see, coming back to your question, is the UK really positioning itself to have a good relationship with what remains of the European Union if we were to leave, and to actually at the same time become more innovative, focusing more on investment and addressing some of the deep-rooted problems we have in the UK.
Are you not discouraged by the fact that the Governor of the Bank of England, the IMF, the OECD, to name but a few, it would seem a very large global coalition of economists seem to disagree with you?
I think at the end of the day, everyone's entitled to their opinion. The thing I would think is quite surprising, every economic debate I've ever known has had two different sides to the story. I think most people find it quite strange if you were to start arguing that this would be the first economic debate of modern history that only had one side to the argument. Of course not. And I would actually argue that there's deep-rooted problems if we were to remain in the European Union. I think it's the slow growth region of the future. If we were to leave, clearly there would be challenges in the near term, but we have the ability in the longer term to certainly position the UK economy to do far better with Brexit and outside the European Union.
The pro-Brexit economist Gerard Lyons. You're listening to Business Daily from the BBC with Ed Butler. Now, it's one of the biggest construction projects in southeast Europe. Its supporters say that the Belgrade waterfront development could transform Serbia's capital city after decades of decline and stagnation. But an increasing number of people are protesting against this project. They cite concerns over transparency, public consultation, and most recently a disturbing incident in which masked men supervised demolitions in the middle of the night. Our correspondent, Guy Delaunay, has been meeting people on both sides of the debate in Belgrade.
The area around the main railway station is rarely the most beautiful part of a city, and that's certainly the case here in Belgrade. It's a run-down mess of roads clogged with lorries, crumbling buildings, and, in the railway yards, rotting, graffiti-covered rolling stock. But all that's due to change over the next 15 years. The Belgrade waterfront project paints a shiny vision of new residential, retail and recreation spaces. The cash and the developer, Eagle Hills, both come from the United Arab Emirates. But the head of Belgrade's City Planning Department, Milutin Folic, says local people and businesses will benefit the most.
Belgrade waterfront is a very big and probably the most important project in the recent Belgrade's history. Such a project of such scale in this moment will also put the construction industry on its legs. Consequently, the other parts of the economy will also see the benefits from this project. I think that it really adds value to the city.
But adding value isn't the way these protesters see it. They view Belgrade waterfront as a land grab, with public property handed over to a private developer without a proper process.
This is becoming a regular occurrence. Thousands of people gathering on the streets of Belgrade, and they're protesting against the massive Belgrade waterfront development. They're flying flags emblazoned with a caricature of a yellow rubber duck, and their message is simple: Ne davimo Beograd, don't drown Belgrade.
We say don't drown Belgrade because they are trying to take away our city and drown it with malicious project Belgrade waterfront.
Luka Kanajovic-Strika is part of the Don't Drown Belgrade movement.
Basically, they said there will be no tender because we have the best investor already. They just announced that it will be done this way and covered it by changing the laws where necessary or just ignoring them where they couldn't change it.
What would you have liked to have happened to this area?
I don't mind cleaning up the trash, but not when the price is giving away the land where the trash stood on. Because making expensive housing doesn't have any benefit to the citizens. Leaving it as it was would be more beneficial because the city and the country would be richer for a potential future when we can develop it as we want.
But Belgrade has been waiting for a better future for decades now. Traditionally, this city of 2 million people has been one of the most important and vibrant places in Southeast Europe. But the past 25 years haven't been kind, taking in conflict, international embargoes and NATO bombs. Then, just as it was getting back on its feet, the European economic crisis hit hard. The senior partner at auditors KPMG in Serbia is James Thornley. He says there's a strong business case for projects like Belgrade Waterfront.
If a major investor came to us and asked where would they locate 500 people or 1,000 people, we'd struggle to advise them where to go at the moment. There's only really 2 international standard shopping centres where you might expect for a population of this size. There really is potentially a demand for what's being offered. We're seeing a lot of activity around the financial technology industry, fintech. Opportunities for the place to have a hub where people can live and work must be a positive thing because there aren't that many places at the moment.
Arguments like that don't convince the protesters. They point to an incident in April when masked men with baseball bats enforced the midnight demolition of buildings which had stood in the way of Belgrade Waterfront. Prime Minister Aleksandar Vučić has since confirmed that the city authorities were behind the episode. Luka Knežević-Strika says this shows the government isn't looking after its citizens.
I'm really afraid for the system when events like this happen. I think there cannot be good intentions behind something that turns out to be government-sponsored terrorism.
While families flock to the new riverside leisure area, the protests are likely to continue. People in Serbia have learned to be deeply suspicious after decades of dodgy sell-offs and promises which have come to nothing. Belgrade Waterfront now needs to do a lot of bridge building to show it's not going to fall into that category as well.
Guy Delaunay reporting there from Serbia. Well, that's just about it from us for today, from everyone on Business Daily. Do have a great weekend.